Здравствуйте, товарищи. Welcome back to Russian Through Propaganda. Today is day 51. We're starting book two. And before we start with some new grammar topics, we're going to spend a couple of days here on review, starting today with pronunciation. And so today we're going to be hitting some highlights, and we're going to be focusing on some problems that tend to linger even for students in second semester or even second year Russian, right? So these are things it would really be nice to eliminate from our pronunciation of Russian, right? Certain mistakes that are very conspicuous and very common. But if you have time, it would actually be a great idea to go all the way back to lessons one, two, and three and just replay all of those because now uh, your ear is probably much more accustomed to Russian sounds. And so things like the Russian vowel "ü," or for example, the distinction between a hard D and a soft D or a hard T and a soft T, right? On day one, that probably was very difficult to hear, much less pronounced, right? But now, after enough exposure to it, it becomes easier to distinguish those sounds, and that kind of goes hand in hand with pronouncing them well. So, no matter what language you're studying, especially one as unfamiliar probably as Russian, it really pays off every so often, maybe every few months, to go back to the very beginning of your studies with all of the stuff on phonetics and spelling and things like that, and just review the basics because it'll be a lot easier the second and third time around. Okay, so today we're going to, in this lesson, we're going to just hit the highlights and we're going to focus on problems that, again, continue to plague Russian students, even though otherwise they might know Russian quite well, right? First off, remember that Russian, as a general rule, has very, very few silent letters, right? So if we're writing a letter on the page, we're almost always saying it. We're going to look at a few very unusual exceptions here in just a moment. But let's start with vowels, right? Vowels are always pronounced in Russian. Well, except for one exception here in a moment, right? So there are always exceptions, but as a general rule, this is almost universally valid, right? If we're writing a vowel on the page, we're pronouncing the vowel. Um, One result of that is that a Russian word has as many syllables as it has vowels, right? So you count the vowels, the vowel letters. Each of those is going to constitute a syllable because each of them is pronounced, right? So we're going to start out with the Russian letter yeah. Of course, at this stage, everyone knows what that is, right, in theory. But again, because of interference from English, it often happens that a Russian yeah in a certain position, for example, at the end of a word, we may see that and think sort of by analogy to an English word like toe, right? TOE, where that final E isn't pronounced. It isn't a separate syllable. And students tend not to pronounce that final yeah, for example. Okay, but remember that's never going to happen in Russian. A Russian yeah is yeah, usually. More on that in a moment. And so we need to hear that full syllable, right? And also, usually we'll hear that yeah sound at the beginning, right? Remember, yeah is a soft vowel. That letter yeah, which looks like English E, represents the Russian vowel right? And in front of it, the yeah, right? The consonant sound yeah, giving yeah, right? Okay, let's look at a couple of examples. And by the way, keep in mind as we're doing this today that I'm not a native speaker of Russian. I don't claim to have perfect pronunciation. I think it's okay. It's serviceable in terms of pedagogical purposes, but certainly at this stage, also I would recommend that you find some other videos with native speakers. They're very easy to find, obviously, and well, not to mention speaking with, interacting with native speakers as much as you can, if you happen to know any, right? But anyway, today we'll look at together at some issues that will uh, crop up quite often, right? So again, starting with yeah, moria is the word for sea, moria, and count the vowels, right? Or yeah, two vowels, two syllables, moria. The word for building is zdanie, zdanie, right? Yeah. Three vowels, three syllables. Okay, here's one that's would typically cause problems. Novaya, right? Again, people see that and I think they think about English words like toe, and they don't pronounce the final e, or the yeah, I should say. Novaya, novaya, novaya. Plural adjective, novaya, novaya. And finally, хорошая. Again, yeah, хорошая. Four vowels, four syllables. Now remember, if we have an initial Russian yeah, we're going to hear very clearly that yeah sound at the beginning. Его, ее, еще, еда, yosh. Okay, there's the yo. Remember that with the dots above it, right? That's the yo. Uh, but again, that also begins with the ye consonant sound. Evropa. And by the way, don't forget this letter a, right? There are a couple of letters we're going to look at today that students often tend to kind of forget about, really, because they're relatively infrequent. And again, this a uh, is just simply the vowel a, right, without the y at the beginning, right? So if these are initial, then of course we're not going to hear y. We're going to say eta, etaj, ekran, echa, right? So that letter is quite infrequent, and in fact, three of these four examples we see here are not from Russian, right? Etage, ekran, both borrowed from French. Echa is a Greek word, right? So this vowel all by itself, is relatively unusual in Russian, and therefore, again, students tend to forget about this letter altogether. Now, to add one more difficulty here to this issue of versus yeah and so forth, first off, in native Russian words, if the yeah is written following a hushing consonant or tsa, then it's typically pronounced as though it were simply right? You don't hear the y. So, for example, nasha, serce, right? So there's one little detail. Now, another issue that's becoming more and more important these days, I'd say, as Russian continues borrowing words from English. Now, of course, historically, Russian borrowed a lot of words from French. And so both English and French obviously has the letter E, right? And for whatever reason, Russian has tended to write Russian yeah in place of French or English E, even though in the original French or English, that E sound represented a simple vowel, not yeah, not a sound with a yeah at the beginning. Okay, so the long and short of it is that quite often in borrowed words, you'll see yeah, but you'll say And that's kind of frustrating, right? It's kind of an accident of orthography, I guess, in terms of the history of borrowing words. I mean, if we were being a bit more consistent, we would simply write and it would be crystal clear, how a word is to be pronounced. But again, so basically be on the lookout for these borrowed words and listen for how Russians are actually saying them. Look at a couple here. Internet, right? Obviously a borrowed word. That's pronounced internet, right? Not internet, right? There's no y sound in those yes, right? Even though that's what we're writing. Another example from French, café, right? Not café, right? Now, again, as almost always happens, there are exceptions to the exception, right? So even though, for example, the word coffee, coffee, is obviously also a borrowed word, we write yeah, and indeed we say yeah, right? So we say coffee, not coffee or something, right? Okay, so you can see how that's quite unpredictable, right? Why do we say café but not coffee, right? Why do we say coffee? Okay, so again, ultimately you have to treat this on a word-by-word basis, but generally speaking, especially words more recently borrowed from English, of which there are a lot, you're usually writing yeah, and you would assume that you're going to be saying ah. Okay, let's move on. Again, we've said already that Russian has very few silent letters. Let's look here at just a few of the extremely rare exceptions. There are others, but most of them would involve similar clusters to the ones we're seeing right here in these few examples. I mean, the other examples most of them would be a bit more unusual, so I've tried here to take a few common ones. And basically, we're just dropping a consonant from the pronunciation because it's involved in some kind of a cluster that's difficult to pronounce. Okay, so instead of zdravствуйте, right, we say здравствуйте, здравствуйте, no v. We say not счастливый, right, but rather счастливый, right? We drop the t. Счастливый. We say чувство, чувство, with no v. We say поздно, with no d. Солнце, with no l. And finally, very unusually, we have two letters dropped out. Uy, right? Not пожалуйста, but пожалуйста. As you probably know, we simply say пожалуйста, пожалуйста. And you can imagine why that happened, right? It's a very common word, very common expression. And it's much easier to say пожалуйста than пожалуйста, right? Okay, Let's look at another often neglected Russian letter, sh with the tail. Right, so we have these two hushing consonants. The first one's very easy to pronounce, simply sh, and then the second one with the tail is the one students tend to forget about. And the reason is obvious. It's not very common, right? We see the sh without the tail all over the place. The one with the tail is a little bit more unusual. And the trick to pronouncing it is to remember that it's a double consonant, right? So the length of this consonant is really more important than its quality, right? So let's start out with just simply sh without the tail. Again, that's no problem to pronounce. Shutka, nash, mashina, karandash, and now we're getting the tail, shinok, right? So sh, you want to hold that basically twice as long as you would a normal consonant. Also, it's pronounced a bit further forward in the mouth, right? But that's maybe not quite as important as the length. Shinok, shotka, right? Now, as with so many things, right, if a Russian is speaking quickly, it may be very hard to pick up on that difference at this stage of your studies, but you can hear it. Even if a Russian is speaking quickly, you can hear this difference. Anyway, some more examples. Борщ, чищу, еще, общежитие, товарищ, товарищи. Okay, a few more weird examples, weird exceptions involving consonants, right? Just kind of a grab bag here of weird exceptions. The combination S, cha is usually pronounced like sh, right? So it's not scha or something, but simply счастье, счастье, счастливый, as we saw earlier. Счет, meaning a bill or an account. Similarly, cha in certain positions, again, rather unusual, is pronounced like sh, like in a very common word here, конечно, конечно, instead of конечно, right? Конечно, конечно. The word for man is mужчина, right? Also a very unusual combination. I can't even think of another word that has this off the top of my head. But anyway, the zh, ch there is pronounced sh, mужчина, mужчина, right? The word for what, the question word is что, right? Not что, right? Instead we say что. Let's look at the word for God, Bog, Bog. That is actually a kind of it's a church Slavonic devoicing at the end of a word, right? That final voiced consonant is devoiced in a way that isn't typical of modern Russian. Of course, usually a Russian g would devoice to a ka, right? But in other Slavic languages, you get a different sort of sequence there. We get the same thing in two adjectives, light and soft. We say легкий and мягкий, right? So again, there we have the g that's devoicing in front of the unvoiced consonant ka. Again, that's very unusual. And again, off the top of my head, I can't think of other words that have this combo, right? These two adjectives are very unusual in that sense. Okay, remember that we have a lot of words where, very unusually for Russian, we pronounce the g as a v, right? That's really kind of off the wall and probably three for a loop when you first saw it. But I think now you should be able to spot that almost always, right? Let's start out with the pronoun его, right? Which could be an accusative case or a genitive case for the pronoun on, or it could also describe possession, right? His, его. Okay, that's basically a genitive form, and we see that carrying over, that same little exception carrying over to, for example, adjectival genitive endings, right? Where we get some version of его or ова and so forth. All right, so here are some more examples. У него, right, at him, literally, he has. Сегодня, we can see that его lurking in there, and that сегодня, literally of this day, was the original meaning. So that's actually a little compound genitive expression that's been, it's turned into a single adverb nowadays. And finally, some just ordinary adjectives in the genitive. Хорошего, нового. Okay, so watch out for that g, right, in those genitive endings. Again, that would be a pretty blatant mistake, right, to pronounce it as a g. It would sound like you're speaking shared Slavonic or something. Okay, what about the reflexive particle? Okay, here's something that I would really urge you to circle because it's an extremely common mistake. And on the one hand, again, it's not the end of the world if you do this. You're not going to be misunderstood, but it does sound a bit silly. And on top of that, this is so common that it's really worth trying to nail this down, right? We're talking about the reflexive particle, right, which is very common in Russian. We talked about it quite a bit. Basically, any reflexive form, right, where you have a sya, any form of a verb with the sya that ends in a te, right? If you have a t, a Russian t anywhere in that ending, you're not going to pronounce it as it's written on the page, right? So let's look at the three examples. We've got the infinitive, we've got the third singular, and the third plural, right? They all involve a te. Let's see what we write and what we actually say, right? So we write вернуться, вернется, вернуться, right? With that sya. But we actually say something more like a ts, right? That t and the s are kind of conflated into a ts, then followed simply by an a, right? So we say вернуться, вернется, вернуться. Now, keep in mind that any other reflexive form that doesn't have a te is going to be pronounced as written, right? So again, we're usually with reflexive verbs, we're following this general principle that we're basically saying what's written on the page. So for example, вернемся and вернулся, right? No issue there at all. But again, with the T, the forms with the te, really watch out for those and try to train yourself to pronounce them as Russians actually do. Okay, what about the vowel U, right? A very unfamiliar vowel. Now remember, to pronounce the vowel correctly, the key is tongue position, right? The U is somewhere in between a back vowel like a or o, right? Where your tongue is back kind of flat, a, and a front vowel like e, right? So more on that in a moment. Remember that e position is going to be very important for pronouncing soft consonants, right? So e, a, u, right? So see if you can nail that. Now, hopefully you're hearing that well now. Listen again for the distinction between e, and u, u. Hopefully you can hear that now. And again, you can hear the u instead of hearing that as ooey or something ooey, right? As in the word gooey, right? So like any Russian vowel, that oo is a pure vowel, meaning in theory we could hold it indefinitely, right? Because it's just one uniform sound. It doesn't start as one sound and end as another. Okay, more on that in just a moment. So let's pronounce a few words with oo. Ты, мы, рыба, мыло, мыть, увы, сын, рынок, новый, обычно. Okay, by the way, I think typically by a second semester, Russian students don't really have a whole lot of trouble with that, honestly. But by the way, if you're still having trouble, I know there are videos out there where a native speaker will spend probably 10 minutes helping you work on your right? So if you need help with it, just seek a more professional help than I'm able to provide. Okay, anyway, what about vowel purity? Okay, so we just touched on that, right? Russian vowels are pure. That's true of all vowels, but it's most important for us as learners, right, to focus on the Russian o and u, right? Because what happens is English speakers tend to want to say something like o instead of or, and oo instead of oo. And you may remember we talked quite a bit about this, and in class I often tend to kind of overdo this, right? Like oh or ooh, right? And it sounds rather comical, of course, and I always get a few laughs with that. But the issue here is that if students do this even the slightest bit, it really kind of režet sluch, as Russians say, meaning it cuts your hearing. It's like stabbing your ear, right? I don't know how to translate that literally. It's kind of it offends the ear, let's put it that way, right? Because Russian oo is ooh, right? It's not ooh or anything approaching that, right? So the trick again is to have your tongue in the correct position and not wiggle it around and not execute something called an off glide in Russian, in English, sorry, which is what usually happens with certain O and U sounds, right, where we start wiggling our mouth around and we end up not with one pure sound, but with the kind of sequence of sounds, one flowing into the other. Okay, so let's look at a few examples here and really try to check yourself on this. And again, it may be something nice to work on with a native speaker if you happen to know any Russians. Okay, let's start out with U. Okay, U. Улица, университет, урок, тут, трудный, туда, хочу, знаю. Okay, that final example, of course, is U, the soft vowel, but it's still the same vowel sound, the U. Okay, so a couple of things. I think almost anyone should be able to make this sound, right? The sound itself is not the problem. U, right? Again, it's the interference with English that causes trouble. So let's look at some of the simplest examples here. Toot, right? Did you say toot, or something like that, right? Again, even the slightest bit, it sounds very weird in Russian. Tуда, not tuda, right? Tуда. Here's a common one. Хочу. I hear English, speakers learning Russian, they say all the time things like Я хочу, я очень хочу, right? That type of sound, right? You can just tell it sounds quite ridiculous, right? So really work on this. Хочу. Let's go back to university, right? Students often want to say universitet or something, universitet, or some, right? I'm totally bungling it, right? But that initial U is U, right? U, universitet, right? It's not universitet, right? So again, U is always U. Let's look at O, kot, вот, pol, кто, metro. By the way, there's a borrowing from French, right? Metro, right? We pronounce the ye as an e. Его, ее. Okay, there we're writing your, right? But again, that's the same vowel sound. Or it simply has the ye in front of it. Your, ковер. Okay, so let's look at a few simple examples again. Kot, not coat, right? Or coat. Or here's another very common one, right? You hear things like kto это, right? Again, that's kind of a typical, at least American mispronunciation of the Russian, right? The Russian is кто. Okay, let's look at vowel reduction. Now here again is a topic, if you want to go back to day 2, we treat this in a lot of detail, and we had these big tables up that I had mentioned were probably almost too much information. So today we're going to take a much more simplified, more pragmatic approach to this. The two most important, what do we mean by vowel reduction? Well, we mean that just because we're writing and say an o doesn't mean we're always pronouncing it as o, right? It may be reduced based on its position vis-a-vis the stressed syllable. It may reduce to a different vowel sound. Okay, the two most important vowels here, the most conspicuous in terms of vowel reduction, are a and o. So those are the ones you really want to focus on. Now, again, if you want the whole breakdown of this, you can go back to day 2, I believe it is, with the tables. But I think at this point, in time, this becomes a little bit more intuitive, so we can kind of relax a little bit. And let's just look at some simple examples. Now, let's start with ah. Now, remember, if the vowel is stressed, we're going to hear its full quality. We're going to hear its actual sort of true sound. For example, after, right? The ah is pronounced ah when stressed. It's also pronounced ah if it's in the syllable directly before the stressed syllable, right? So strana. Okay, but in all other positions, right after the stressed syllable or maybe 2 syllables in front of the stressed syllable, it reduces to Gazeta. Karandash. Okay, so just compare. Remember, we can transcribe these sort of very roughly, right, using the English alphabet to show what we're actually saying despite what we're writing in Russian. Okay, let's look at O. Here's the most important one, the most difficult one, because the letter O can represent 3 different sounds in Russian, right? It's going to represent O when stressed, of course, as in urok, but in the If it's in the syllable directly before the stressed syllable, it reduces to ah. Vapros, vapros. Elsewhere, sort of like with ah, it reduces to right? Like дело, дело. Zolota, zolota. Okay, so part of the trick here generally, as again, the more you're exposed to this, you'll just get used to it and you won't even have to think about it. But I think the starting point is just to always keep in mind as you're reading that just because we see an ah or an o on the page, it doesn't mean that's what we're actually pronouncing. As long as you keep that in mind, I think it can help to start picking up on these patterns. Now, the two other vowels that reduce are yeah and ya. And these, to my mind, are much less important because they're just not quite as conspicuous. So to me, it's not quite as big of a deal for first year students, especially as ah and o. But essentially, unstressed yeah and ya tend to reduce to more of an I type sound, right? Not yeah or ya, but more like I or yeah. Okay, so let's start out with yeah. Okay, when it's stressed, of course, we're going to say yeah, as in Soviet, Soviet. At the end of a word, right in the final position, it also doesn't reduce. Занятие, занятие. Right? But elsewhere, it sounds more like ye in the initial position in a word, like еда, еда. Or elsewhere, more like simply I, серебро, серебро. Right? Note that we're not hearing a ye sound there. We're not saying серебро or something, but simply серебро, серебро. Similarly, ya, when stressed, is ya, yablaka. It's ya at the end of a word, right? Much like ah. Now that's very important because if you think about it, any, for example, soft feminine noun, right, in the nominative singular is going to end in ya, and if it's unstressed, it's going to be reduced, right? So, for example, дядя, дядя, or Япония, right? The first one goes to ye, the final one goes to ya, Япония. And finally, серебряная, серебряная. Let's look at a poster quickly. Про это. This is the design for the cover of a poem by Mayakovsky. Про это. Let's look at that. That's actually a prepositional phrase, and we know that usually in Russian, the preposition itself won't carry stress, right? So any o we have in a preposition, like in pro, which means about, is going to be reduced to ah, right? So pra, and then eta, right? Is stressed, meaning the unstressed o is reduced to right? So pra eta, right? So check yourself and make sure you're not saying pro eto, pra eta. Okay, by the way, that the woman on that cover is Lilia Brick, who was sort of Mayakovsky's muse, and he was basically obsessed with her. Unfortunately, when he met her, she was already married. Okay, let's look at some more words and just practice, pay attention to vowel reduction. And so again, pay careful attention to what we're writing, what you're seeing on the page, and what we're actually saying. Он, она, оно, голос, кошмар, колокол, колокола, сторона, одеяло, вокзал, большой, хороший, аптека, собака, суббота, ложка, чашка, подарок, шоколад, масло, папа, мама, подруга, никогда, невеста, Европа, отец, парень, мнение, едет, дядя, тетя, теория, январь, порция, песня. And now a few examples with prepositions. Again, we're looking here for o, and o in the preposition, that's always going to reduce to а. О России, во мгле, со мной, обо мне. Okay, let's talk now about consonants, starting with a famous poster for a very famous piece of cinematic history, right, by Dziga Viertov. If you're into film, you might want to check this out. It's called Kino Glass. Okay, now look at the second component of this little hyphenated word here. Glass, meaning I, is the final Z is devoiced to a S, right? So we know that Russian consonants, quite a few of them can be grouped into voiced and unvoiced pairs, right? And here's a quick rundown of those, right? V and F, basically you can almost use these to think about them in terms of the English equivalent, right? Z, S, and so forth, right? The first letter here in these pairs is voiced, meaning it's pronounced with the vocal cords moving, right? Whereas the unvoiced component is pronounced with no vibration of the vocal cords, right? So take, for example, V and F, right? V, F. You can see that those sounds are basically the same, except for this vocalization, right? The voicing. Okay, so let's look at some examples. Now, this is most important with final consonants, right? If you have a final consonant in a word that would normally be voiced, it becomes devoiced. This is very conspicuous and therefore very important. So this, again, if you're trying to circle things that are most important in today's lesson, this would be one right here. For example, the word for city is not gorod. It's gorod, right? As though you had a final t, right? It's not etage, but etage, etage. The word for oak is not do. Now there I go again. It's not doob, certainly. It's also not doob, right? It's doop, right? Devoicing. Ble becomes pe. The word for ice, again, final de, we say not lyod, but lyot. The word for eye is glass, union, sayus, garden, sad, and lion, lief, right, where we're saying a v. The same is true for final soft consonants that normally would be voiced, like a final soft D or a final soft V sound in Russian. Those also devoice, but of course to their soft equivalents, right? So soft D devoices to a soft T, and so on. Okay, so instead of for bear, we don't say medvedz, we say medvedz, right, with a final soft T. The word for dirt is gryaz, right, with a s at the end. The word for lies, this is a bit, something a bit different. We're going to talk about this more in a moment. There isn't, basically, je, as we know, reduces to sh, but the point is that there isn't a hard versus soft sh in Russian in any important sense, right? For the way you would have, for example, in Polish, you would have a hard sh, a soft sh, right? So basically what that means here is that we're pronouncing this as though it were written L-O sh, right? Losh. There's nothing, basically the soft sign here doesn't really mean a whole lot. More on that in a moment. Anyway, the word for blood is krosh, right? So a f sound at the end, soft F, not soft V. Okay, the same thing happens in consonant clusters, right? You have two consonants coming up against each other. In Russian, typically the second consonant dominates. The first one assimilates to the second one, and that also applies to voicing, right? If the second one is unvoiced, the first one is going to also become devoiced. So we say things like vparke. Now there, of course, we have a prepositional phrase, but remember that those are typically pronounced as though they were a single word, right? Especially when we have one of these prepositions that's simply a consonant, right? We have to pronounce that along with what follows. And so we get vparke, right? The v is devoicing to become more like the unvoiced p. Vodka, right? The becomes more like t because of the following unvoiced consonant ka. Loshka, again, sh, right? Loshka. And finally, after. Now, less frequently in Russian, you can have voicing, right? Assimilation by becoming voiced. This is much less common. So let's just look at an example. Занятие, right? Вокзал, сдача, right? The first one, look at that, занятие, right? That happens sometimes, right? Where you have the s, the preposition, followed by a word that begins in z, right? The s is going to assimilate to that z, right? Vokzal, because of the z, which is voiced. The ka also becomes voiced, and we say vag, vokzal, as though it were a g. And finally, with change, the initial s becomes more like a z, and we say z, zdacha, zdacha. Okay, one more thing today. What about hard versus soft consonants? So again, you can go back and look at this in a lot more detail on day 2. So let's just review the basics. Remember that typically Russian hard consonants are what we're used to from English, right? So when we think like English D, like da, day, do, right? That's basically hard D and hard the in Russian. So the trick for us is not usually the hard consonants, it's the soft ones. And the secret is tongue position, right? We need to get our tongue in the E or Y position, right? The position we need up near the front and top of the mouth, the position for pronouncing the vowel E or the consonant Y, right? E, Y. You might try kind of going back and forth there. E, Y, E, Y, E, Y, E, Y, right? That could really help you really nail that position. And again, the trick is when we go to pronounce a soft consonant, we need to get our tongue, we need to train it to hit that position instead of dropping back into the some kind of back position that we would normally use for, again, English D, as in do or don't or day, right? So let's take the word, speaking of day, the Russian is день, день. Okay, so let's practice the soft E. День, день, right? So we're keeping it in the E position, and without letting it drop, without letting our tongue relax, we're reaching down to do what we have to do to make a D. День, день. We also have, of course, here a soft N, right? In, right? Now, again, if you drop your tongue back, you're going to say something like n, as in no, or, what's another word that starts with an N? I can't think of one, I'm just having a rough day. Okay, so anyway, work on this. Now, one other thing to listen for is to make sure you're not, again, taking this weird Russian soft D, which you're not very familiar with probably, and hearing it and pronouncing it as something more familiar, for example, j. Okay, we hear that sometimes like jing, or something a little bit less obvious, but again, something that's more like j than like the actual Russian j, right? Ding, ding, not jing, not jing, right? Okay, so keep practicing this. And again, you might look for other videos that can help you with your soft consonants in Russian. Let's read some more words. Now, by the way, one thing I forgot, how do we know a Russian consonant is soft? Well, by what follows it, right? Remember, Russian doesn't, like some Slavic languages have different letters for certain soft consonants, right? But Russian doesn't. We have to look at what comes after. And the convention is that if a consonant is followed by a soft sign or by one of the soft vowels, right? That is ya, you, yeah, your, right? Any of those vowels that begin with the y sound, or the fifth soft vowel is E, right? Now, if we think about that for a moment, it's no big mystery because we know that right, those positions, the E and then the Y, right, that sound that begins each of those four, the special soft vowel letters, ya, you, yeah, your, that's the palatalized position. So it all kind of hangs together if you think about it. Okay, let's read a few more words here. День, дядя, тетя, дерево, жизнь, любовь, рубль, они, осень, Неделя. Look at that example. All three consonants are soft, right? N, B, and L because they're all followed by a soft vowel, right? Неделя. Восемь. Восемь. Сегодня. Сегодня. You may also remember, and again, if you go back and review day 2, that you can kind of rank these soft consonants in terms of how conspicuous they are and how much attention you should give them, right? So, for example, soft D, soft N, soft T, I would also say soft L. Those are quite important and somewhat difficult to make. Now, as you go down the list and you get to like soft M and so forth, soft R is another one. I wouldn't let those keep me up at night. Basically, they're not quite as important. They're not quite as common either, and so I'd really focus on again soft N, soft D, soft L, soft N for now. Okay, a couple more details here. There are certain letters in Russian that they're not classified in terms of this hard versus soft distinction, right? So, for example, there's not hard versus soft zh or sh or ts, right, as there would be in some languages, right? Those are considered hard by definition, while ch and sh are considered soft. So that doesn't really mean too much, actually. The only thing that is important for us is to know that writing a soft sign after any of those 5 letters doesn't affect how we're saying it, right? Because there is no special soft version of those letters as opposed to their hard version. So it ends up basically that sometimes we're writing a soft sign for reasons that have nothing to do with phonetics in modern Russian. We're actually going to learn a lot more about why this is in a few lessons here. We're going to learn a new type of noun that's often marked by a final soft sign. So let's read a few examples here. The words ночь, мышь, and вещь all end in a soft sign, and the reason essentially is that those are a special kind of noun, a special kind of feminine noun, but that soft sign is not affecting the pronunciation. So here you could really just pretend it's not even there and say again, ночь, мышь, вещь. Right, now we know another instance of this in the second singular verb endings in the conjugated forms of verbs like читаешь. Right, that soft sign is just kind of sitting there. It's not affecting the pronunciation. Читаешь, читаешь, just an ordinary sh at the end. One last detail of spelling that always confuses students. Take the word article, which I think may have been the first word we learned like this, or one of them. It's stats. Stats, ya. Okay, so the point is that this soft sign there is being written for a reason. It's not superfluous, and this letter is pronounced differently as written than it would be if it were written without the soft sign. So break this down visually and try to get a handle on what's going on here, right? We have first stats, right? So we have the first part of the word ending in a soft T, stats. Okay, and then following that soft T, we have a completely separate letter, a full soft vowel, ya. Right, so we're saying exactly what we're writing, statsya. Okay, so it can be very hard to hear that at first in the normal flow of speech, but you can hear this, and for reasons, if you want to practice, it often helps to make a little pause there, like statsya, right? Make a little pause so that you can pronounce first the full soft consonant and then the full soft vowel without letting them run together, right? And then as you keep practicing, try to make that pause as inconspicuous as you possibly can. Let's look at a few more examples. Пьет, белье, статья, платье. Okay, again, that's a tricky thing, and it would be a great idea if you know a Russian to work with them on this and really hear exactly the way they do it. So one reason that confuses students is, I'll give you a quick example. What if we take a soft masculine noun like slavar, right, which ends in er soft sign, right? So we have basically a final soft sign on that soft masculine noun. And what if we want to make that genitive? Well, instead of adding, since it's soft, instead of adding ah, we add ya. And in so doing, we get rid of the soft sign, right? Because we don't need the soft sign anymore. We now have the ya to signal that that final is soft, right? So what that's telling us basically is that the word Slovaria ends in a soft followed by the vowel sound ah, right? Now again, in a noun like statia, we have something different going on. We have a full soft consonant followed not simply by a vowel sound, but by a full soft vowel, ya, statia, statia. Okay, so that's the difference there. So watch out for that. And anyway, that's it for today, right? So the next couple of days, we're going to review our verb conjugations, which is one of the most challenging and certainly most important things about learning Russian. So we'll spend a couple of days reviewing that, and hopefully you'll be much more comfortable with that as we go forward. Until then, вперед, товарищи, к новым победам, right, onward to new victories. До свидания, товарищи.